Hello, I'm reading you an English story. Well, a story in English now. It's an English translation of a German story. The story is called "A World Ends," and it's by Wolfgang Hildesheimer, who's a Jewish German writer of the post-war, writing during the post-war. The story is included in a collection called Anti-Story. Yes, I am aware that everything is backwards, but just showing you the book. The collection is called Anti-Story, an anthology of experimental fiction. So we're looking at unusual fiction. While we listen to this story, I'd like to suggest that we think in what way the story sounds experimental, unusual. Maybe listen to or try to think of what makes it absurd, what makes us think of it as strange or unusual, and most importantly, think of what effect that achieves, what kind of message is conveyed through the use of the absurd or the unusual, the bizarre, the unexpected, how language contributes to that effect, and particularly how humor is used in this case in particular. We are thinking maybe social critique, we're thinking aesthetic critique, political critique. Let's see what comes up. A World Ends from the 1960s. A World Ends by Wolfgang Hildesheimer. The Marchesa Montetristo's last evening party has impressed itself indelibly on my memory. This is partly due, of course, to its extraordinary conclusion, but in other ways as well the evening was unforgettable. My acquaintance with the Marchesa, a waterman by birth of Little Gidding, Ohio, came about by a coincidence. I had sold her, through the intermediary of my friend Herr von Pelhun, I mean, of course, the Abram a Santa Clara expert, not the neo-mystic, the bathtub in which Marat was murdered. It is perhaps not generally known that it had been until then in my possession. Gambling debts obliged me to offer it for sale. So it was that I came to the Marchesa, who had long wanted this appliance for her collection of 18th century washing utensils. This was the occasion of my getting to know her. From the bathtub our conversation soon passed to more general aesthetic topics. I noticed that the possession of this collector's piece had given me a certain prestige in her eyes. And I was not surprised when one day I was invited to one of her famous parties in her palazzo on the artificial island of San Amerigo. The Marchesa had had the island thrown up a few miles southeast of Murano on a sudden whim, for she detested the mainland. She said it was hurtful to her spiritual equilibrium, and she could find nothing to suit her in the existing stock of islands. So here she resided, devoting her life to the cult of the antique and forgotten, or as she liked to put it, the true and eternal. The invitation card gave the time of the party as 8 o'clock, which meant that the guests were expected at 10. So custom ordered it. Further, it ordered that the guests should come in gondolas. In this fashion, it is true, the crossing lasted nearly 2 hours and was moreover uncomfortable when the sea was rough, but these were unwritten rules of behaviour at which no one but a barbarian would cavil, and barbarians were not invited. Besides, many of the younger guests, not yet fully sensible of the dignity of the occasion, would hire a vaporetto to take them within 100 yards of the island, whence they were ferried over, one by one, in a gondola, which had been brought in tow. The splendour of the building needs no description from me. For outside it was an exact replica of the Palazzo Vendramin. and inside every period from the Gothic onward was represented. But of course they were not intermingled. Each one had its own room. The Marchesa could really not be accused of breaches of style. Nor need the opulence of the catering be referred to her. Anyone who has ever attended a state banquet in a monarchy, and it is to such that I principally addressed myself, knows what it was like. Moreover, it would hardly be true to the spirit of the Marchesa and her circle to mention the pleasures of the table, especially here, where I had to describe the last hours on earth of some of the most eminent figures of the age, which I, as sole survivor, had the privilege to witness. After exchanging a few civilities with my hostess and stroking the long-haired Pekingese, which never stirred from her side, I was introduced to Dąbrowska, a woman doubly famous, first for her contributions to the rhythmic expressionist dance, a vanishing art form, and secondly as the author of the book Back to Youth, which, as the title indicates, argued in favour of a return to youthfulness of style, and which, I need hardly remind the reader, has won adherents far and wide. While we were chatting together, an elderly gentleman of upright bearing came up to us. It was Golch, the Golch. Unnecessary to give further particulars of a man whose share in the enrichment of our intellectual life is so widely known. The Dąbrowska introduced me. Herr Siebold, the late owner of Marat's bathtub. My fame had spread. "Aha!" said Golch. I inferred from the inflection he gave to these syllables that he was weighing my potentialities as a candidate for the cultural elite. I asked him how he had liked the exhibition of contemporary painting in Luxembourg. For one might, indeed one must, assume that those here assembled had seen, read, and heard everything of any real importance. That was why they were here. Golch raised his eyes as if looking for a word in space and said, "Passé." He used the English accentuation of the word which was then in fashion. The words cliché and pastiche too were pronounced à l'anglaise. I don't know what the current usage is. I am now too much taken up with everyday affairs to concern myself with such matters. I noticed, in any case, that I had blundered in thus mentioning the contemporary. I had gone down a step, but I had learnt my lesson. A move was made to the buffet. Here I encountered Signora Sgambati, the astrologer, who had recently made a considerable stir by her theory that not only the fate of individuals, but whole trends in the history of ideas could be read in the stars. She was no ordinary phenomenon, this Gambati, as was at once clear from her appearance. Yet I find it incomprehensible in the circumstances that she did not see in the constellation of the heavens the imminent engulfment of so many substantial members of the intellectual world. She was deep in conversation with Professor Kuntz Sartori, the politician and royalist, who had been trying for decades to introduce a monarchy in Switzerland. Another notable figure. After taking some refreshment, the company moved to the Silver Room for what was to be the climax of the evening's entertainment. A performance of a special kind, the world premiere of 2 flute sonatas by Antonio Giambattista Bloch, a contemporary and friend of Rameau, who had been discovered by the musicologist Weltley. He too, of course, was there. They were played by the flutist Berenguer. Yes, a descendant, and accompanied by the Marchesa herself on the self-same harpsichord on which Celestine Rameau had initiated her son into the fundamental principles of counterpoint, and which had been sent for from Paris. The flute, too, had a history, but I have forgotten it. The two performers had put on rococo costume for the occasion, and the little ensemble looked, they had purposely so arranged themselves, like a picture by Watteau. The performance, of course, took place by the dimmest of candlelight. There was not a person there who would have found electric light for such an occasion anything but intolerable. By a further sensitive whim of the Marchesa, the guests were required after the first sonata, D major, to move over from the silver room, Baroque, to the golden room, early Rococo, there to enjoy the second sonata. For the silver room had a major resonance, the golden, it could not be disputed, a minor. At this point I must remark that the tedious elegance which clings to the flute sonatas of second rank, and more particularly of newly discovered masters of this period, was in the present case to be explained by the fact that no such person as Giambattista Bloch had ever lived. The works here performed had in reality been composed by the musicologist Weltley. Although this circumstance did not become known till later, I cannot, in retrospect, help feeling it a humiliation for the Marchesa that she should have employed her last moments in the interpretation, however masterly, of a forgery. During the second movement of the F minor sonata, I saw a rat creeping along the wall. I was astonished. At first, I thought it might have been lured from its hole by the sound of the flute. Such things do happen, they say. But it was creeping in the opposite direction. It was followed by another rat. I looked at the guests. They had not noticed anything, and indeed most of them were keeping their eyes closed in order to be able to abandon themselves to the harmonies of Weltley's forgery. I now heard a dull reverberation, like a very distant thunder. The floor began to vibrate. Again, I looked at the guests. If they had heard anything, and something they must be hearing, it was at any rate not discernible from their hunched-up postures. I, however, was made uneasy by these strange symptoms. A manservant entered. This is barely the place to remark that in the unusual costume worn by the Marchesa's domestic staff, he looked like a character out of Tosca. He went up to the performers and whispered something in the Marchesa's ear. I saw her turn pale. How well it suited her in the dim candlelight! But she controlled herself and without interruption played the Andante calmly to the end. Then she nodded to the flutist, stood up and addressed the company. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, I have just learned that the foundations of the island and those of the palace with them are breaking up. The Office of Submarine Works has been informed. The right thing, I think we should all agree, is to go on with the music. She sat down again, gave the sign to Monsieur Beranger, and they played the Allegro con brio, the last movement, which did seem to be, to me at the time, though I had not yet an inkling that it was a forgery, little suited to the uniqueness of the situation. On the polished floor, small puddles were forming. The reverberations had grown louder and sounded nearer. Most of the guests were now sitting upright, their faces ashen in the candlelight and looking as if they were long dead already. I stood up and said, I'm going. Not so loud as to give offence to the musicians, but loud enough to intimate to the other guests that I had the courage to admit my fear. The floor was now almost evenly covered with water. Although I walked on tiptoe, I could not help splashing an evening dress or two as I passed. But in view of what was soon to come, the damage I did must be reckoned inconsiderable. Few of the guests thought me worthy of a glance, but I did not care. As I opened the door to the passage, a wave of water poured into the room and caused Lady Fitzjones, the preserver of Celtic customs, to draw her fur wrap more closely about her, no doubt a reflex movement, for it could not be of any use. Before shutting the door behind me, I saw Herr von Perlhun, the neo-mystic, not the Abraham Santa Clara expert, casting a half-contemptuous, half-melancholy glance in my direction. He, too, was now sitting in water almost to his knees. So was the Marchesa, who could no longer use the pedals. I do not, as a matter of fact, know how essential they are on a harpsichord. I remember thinking that if the piece had been a cello sonata, they would perforce have had to break it off here, since the instrument would not sound in water. Strange what irrelevant thoughts occur to one in such moments. In the entrance hall it was suddenly as quiet as in a grotto. Only in the distance the sound of rushing water was to be heard. I divested myself of my tailcoat and was soon swimming through the sinking palace towards the portals. My splashes echoed mysteriously from the walls and columns. Not a soul was to be seen. Evidently the servants had all fled, and why should they not? They had no obligation to the true and eternal culture, and those assembled here had no further need of their services. Outside, the moon shone as if nothing were amiss, and yet a world, no less, was here sinking beneath the ocean. As if at a great distance, I could still hear the high notes of Monsieur Béranger's flute. He had a wonderful embouchure that one must allow him. I unhitched the last gondola which the escaping servants had left behind and pushed out to sea. Through the windows past which I paddled, the water was now flooding into the palace. I saw that the guests had risen from their seats. The sonata must be at the end, for they were clapping, their hands held high over their heads, since the water was now up to their chins. With dignity, the Marchesa and Monsieur Béranger were acknowledging the applause, though in the circumstances they could not bow. The water had now reached the candles. Slowly they were extinguished, and as the darkness grew, it became quiet. The applause was silenced. Suddenly I heard the crash and roar of a building in collapse. The palazzo was falling. I steered the gondola seaward so as not to be hit by plaster fragments. After paddling some hundreds of yards across the lagoon in the direction of the island of San Giorgio, I turned round once more. The sea lay dead calm in the moonlight, as if no island had ever stood there. A pity about the bathtub, I thought, for that was a loss which could never be made good. The thought was perhaps rather heartless, but experience teaches us that we need a certain distance from such events in order to appreciate their full scope. That was A World Ends by Wolfgang Hildesheimer, I should say, Wolfgang Hildesheimer. A story translated from the German. We're going to discuss this story tomorrow on Thursday. Thursday the 8th in Didsbury with the Didsbury reading rooms, together with Eugene Ionesco's The Rhinoceros. So experimental fiction in Didsbury on Thursday. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you think. Please do let me know what you think. Thanks very much.